The 2024 FTC Final Amplifier Rule has gone into effect of August this year. Is that good for the industry or is it bad for the industry? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. Hey folks, I'm Gene Delasello with Audioholics. As you guys know, I'm very proactive in keeping you informed of what's going on with the Federal Trade Commission in regards to the amplifier rule. And we like to hold manufacturers accountable in truth and power, whether it's an AV receiver or a multi-channel amplifier. We've been an advocate of this for many years, authored many articles about this, as well as YouTube videos. In fact, you guys were part of a truth and power movement with us. And we also were trying to keep the FTC rule alive back in 2020. So I'm going to need your help again. We have a call to action and it's time sensitive. We have to put in a petition for the FTC to reopen this rule no later than November 8th. So that's literally days away. And I'm going to present to you why this is so important, why it's so imperative, and why it has really big industry implications if something isn't done soon. We have the same goals and same alignment of what the CTA is trying to do with their petition. We're all on the same page. So that's why I'm teaming together with the CTA, and with the help of you guys, our audience, our power, we can invoke real change that's going to benefit not only the manufacturers, the retail partners, but most importantly, the consumers, so we could get honest specs on amplifiers, receivers, and powered speakers. So I wrote a very complex and detailed article. It's on the homepage. I'll link it down below. I'm going to briefly just show it to you, and then I'm going to get into a slide presentation for a more condensed version of this, so it's more easily understood, and you guys can understand why I'm trying to petition. So let me share my screen here for a second, and we'll go over this. Again, this is on the homepage. And I have this whole article here, and it gives a history of the FTC. And the first thing I want to say is back in 2000, the FTC removed the mandate for media advertising that pertained to three parameters for rating amplifier power: load impedance, rated power bandwidth frequency response, and distortion. Now, the manufacturers still had to disclose this specification of their amplifiers in their product sheets, their spec sheets, whether it was online or in their manuals, but it gave them free rein to basically inflate power on any magnitude of advertising media, whether it was online or in the box stores. And you saw this back in the day when I had a Truth and Power article. You look at some of the Denon receivers or Yamaha receivers, they would slap this sticker on the front panel, 260 watts. Well, if you looked at the fine print, that was one channel driven at 10% distortion at 6 ohms on Tuesday. Completely bogus. What I found with these stickers was they were inflating the power probably twice the amount of what the FTC full power bandwidth should have been. And it's not just Denon or Yamaha. All the manufacturers, the Pioneers, the Onkios, they were all doing it in the advent of Atmos. And I don't think it was a coincidence that this rule was relaxed in 2000 and allowed them to do that. We also saw this with home theater in a box units. You'd get a home theater in a box that had, they claim, 1,000 watts. And what they were doing was they were just adding up the one channel rating and just multiplying it by the number of channels. It was completely bogus. These little systems cannot produce 1,000 watts of power. So back in 2020, the FTC was looking at doing away with this rule entirely. And that's when we had you guys petition to sign comments to get them to save the rule, because we want to have the FTC rule in place, at least as a checks and balance to the industry. And we had, because of our efforts and your proactiveness in this, and other people in the industry were on our same side of wanting to keep this rule alive, the FTC received over 1,133 comments, and it kept the rule alive. Well, now they released the 2024 Final Amplifier Rule. I wasn't even aware of this until recently, and it's made some big changes with big implications. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share this PowerPoint slide presentation with you. We're going to go over this, and we're going to understand why this is so important that you guys are proactive and you do this quickly. So the 2024 FTC Amplifier Rule, big changes and implications ahead, some good and some missteps. So a brief history of what the FTC Amplifier Rule is. It was started back in 1974. It was a way to put some honesty into the industry because the manufacturers of receivers and amplifiers were overinflating their powers in their products. They weren't testing it under any specific standard, and it was basically the wild, wild west of how they spec their amps. So the FTC came along and they said that your amplifiers, and this is back when it was just stereo amplifiers, both channels had to be driven at full power bandwidth from 20 to 20 kilohertz under a specific load impedance, and under distortion had to be disclosed. And this really kind of reined in some of the dishonest power claims, this PMPO stuff and the peak power and all that stuff. It kind of helped to narrow that down and give you more apples to apples comparisons. And in fact, I want to thank Dennis Murphy personally because he peer reviewed my article. He was heavily involved in the FTC decades ago. He was part of the standards body that was regulating this. And I appreciate him overlooking this to make sure that everything I'm presenting to you guys is as accurate and factual as possible. And guys, I encourage you to look up our Truth and Power movement. I'll put a link to that as well on the card so you can look at this whole history. We've been talking about this for years. So what has changed with the new 2024 amplifier rule? The bottom line is they're trying to do one measurement to rule them all. They want to specify power into an 8-ohm load regardless of the impedance that the amplifier is driving, or regardless of the loudspeaker, if it's a powered system, if the in total impedance of the system is 8 ohms or less, if it's 4 ohms, it doesn't matter. They want amplifier power spec'd into an 8-ohm load regardless. And basically, if you look at the standard that is now the Final Amplifier Rule, I'll link that as well. It's in the article, but I'll link it in the description. They want amplifier power to be tested from 250 milliwatts all the way to full rated power level from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz at 8 ohms at or under 1% THD plus N after 5 minutes sine wave signal. This includes stereo and multi-channel amplifiers and even powered loudspeakers. And for multi-channel amplifiers, the spec only applies for the left and right channels. So if you have an amplifier that's 7 channels or 11 channels, the standard gives you no guidance on how to specify the power with all those channels driven. And this is something the FTC was wrestling with for many years. And there was presentations. We actually submitted how we wanted to see power tested for multi-channel amplifiers. It never got through. And then the FTC just, I guess they deemed that it was too complicated of a topic. And they just threw that away, and they stuck with just rating 2 channels driven, just like the original rule of 1974. So the good news about this rule is at least it's making manufacturers adhere to some known standard. You have to test with full power bandwidth. You have to test under 8 ohms. You have to test under a specific distortion of 1% THD plus N, which actually I think that's a pretty fair standard, the 1% for most solid state electronics. We, as you guys know, when we specify amplifier power, when we do measurements, we check it at 1 kilohertz at 0.1% THD plus N and at 1% THD plus N. And then we do a full power bandwidth sweep as well, and we give you that power spec too. So it's good to have all this data. I'm in agreement with the distortion spec. I think that's pretty decent spec to choose for distortion or threshold. And then they also have a more sensible precondition period. So back when the 74 rule came out, they wanted to precondition the amplifiers at 1/3 power for an hour. And that was too stressing on linear AB designs, most amplifiers of the day, because that's the area of the region of the amplifier where it's least efficient and it's dissipating the most power through those heat sinks. And it was just very stressing. So they relaxed that. They made it 1/8 power for an hour. And I think that's sensible. So this is all good, except for when you have a system that's not designed for this bandwidth or impedance. And we'll get more into that into this slide presentation. So the bad of all of this is this rule is applied to all powered devices, whether it's amplifiers, multi-channel receivers, powered speakers, subwoofers. It's all inclusive for closed systems or open systems. And is that fair for speakers? Is that fair for powered speakers? In such systems, performance is more generally governed by the parameters like the sensitivity and it driving lower impedance loads to get more power out of that amplifier. So I think it stands at a disadvantage here by the FTC making this rule stuck at 8 ohms. A full power sine sweep for 5 minutes duration is not realistically representative of how most amplifiers are used. Real program content's not running for 5 minutes straight for a tone. And it only tests for 2 channels of a multi-channel amplifier. We talked about that. It doesn't give us the full capability of what a big multi-channel amplifier can do with multiple channels driven, not just 2 channels driven. And the system may be designed for less bandwidth to protect the speakers, and this should be tested within its passband. So really, there should be specification for if a subwoofer or a powered speaker is designed within a certain bandwidth, then that test should be applied for within that bandwidth, and it should be applied for whatever the load impedance of that system is. As you guys know, most loudspeakers are not 8 ohms, especially when they're multi-drive units, when there's multiple bass drivers in them and they're in parallel. You see most of these systems as being closer to 4 ohms, regardless of how the manufacturer inflates the spec sheets. So basically, manufacturers, and this is something I'm more concerned with, manufacturers can avoid specifying the maximum continuous power, allowing them to bypass the FTC amplifier rule if they disclose that their testing wasn't done under FTC standards. So what that means now is the manufacturers don't have to be compliant with this rule. They just can't say it's continuous max power. They could tell you a product is 500 watts, but again, we get into this gray area where how are they speccing that? What load impedance? What distortion level? What duration? I think that's potentially a problem here, that this rule allows this provision as wiggle room. I don't like it. I would like that to be kind of more reined in so people can understand that. Here's the ugly crux of the situation is this rule will lead to most amplifiers being rated for their maximum power they can sustain at 20 kilohertz, and some even at 20 hertz. Some amplifiers struggle at 20 hertz for sustained output. But the reality is virtually every amplifier I've ever measured over the years has slightly less power at 20 kilohertz than it does at 1 kilohertz. And that doesn't matter if it's class AB or class D. It's just the nature of it. For class AB, because you're dealing with the higher bandwidth, you have less effective feedback at 20 kilohertz. So your distortion rises with frequency. So if you're fixed at 1% THD, usually the amplifier has higher distortion at 20 kilohertz than it does at 1 kilohertz. So now you're derating that amplifier to stay at 1% because of the 20 kilohertz test. And with class D amplifiers, most of them have output filters, and the capacitor on them is very sensitive to sustained tones. And in most cases, the amplifier will either current limit or it will shut down. If you try to present a 20 kilohertz 5-minute max power test on a class D amplifier, it's probably going to shut it down or it's going to current limit. So again, we're not getting the true representation of what that amplifier can do. And here's the ironic situation is at this frequency, at the 20 kilohertz band, that demands the least power in real world content. There's very little energy in music or movies at 20 kilohertz. So why should we restrict the test to 20 kilohertz? So furthermore, there's some big industry impacts that I want to discuss with you guys. Number one, the immediate impact on the August 12, 2024 rule date is that creating urgent challenges for manufacturers already committed to marketing for upcoming product launches. The compliance risk, spec sheets for products manufactured and packaged before this date could lead to non-compliance if sold afterward, posing significant legal risks. It's resource intensive. Manufacturers face the daunting task of potentially reviewing all packaged inventory to update their spec sheets, which could require extensive resources and time. Need for clarity. There is an urgent need for the clarification of whether exemptions will be granted for the thousands of products that were already manufactured and packaged and marketed prior to the August 12, 2024 rule that went into effect. And then marketing disruption. The lacks of guidance and these issues threaten to disrupt the market and negatively impact businesses and operations for many manufacturers. And we are seeing some of this happening and unfolding right now. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. So if you look at the preview we did for the SVS 17 Ultra subwoofers back when they were launched and announced at CEDIA, you look at the specs on here, and this amplifier was rated at 2,800 watts. So if you go on their website now and you look at the products and you narrow down to whether it's the PB or the SB, I think they use similar amplifiers. It's just one is sealed and one's ported. You get all the specs on the drivers. You get all the specs on the cabinet. You get the measurements, but it says nothing about amplifier power. They show you the amplifier. It's the same 2800D Class D amplifier used, and it shows you the the massive 60 amp 200 volt MOSFETs on the output devices, but nowhere on their page does it show max continuous power. And that's a direct result of this new rule. SVS is being very proactive in trying to be compliant with the new rule, and this is to their detriment now. And when you think about what's going on here, SVS took that spec off their website because the FTC mandates it has to be done at 8 ohms. Well, that driver, that beautiful 17-inch driver, might be a 4 ohm driver. So now SVS would have to test that amplifier at 8 ohms instead of 4 ohms. So that amplifier is going to produce less current and thus less power. So now that 2,800 watts could be more like 1,400 watts. It does them a disservice. And I don't think that's fair. And in fact, when you're dealing with powered systems like subwoofers or powered speakers, we should care more about the clean SPL output like we specify with the CEA 2010 when we do those ground plane measurements. And I'm not suggesting anything to the FTC at this point. I just want them to reopen the rule. That way we can make suggestions along with other industry experts in hopes to better this rule. Because right now, this is a problem not only for SVS, but I've seen multiple manufacturers taking off their max continuous power ratings on their spec sheets and their websites because of this new rule. So this is a serious implication that we need to address, hopefully ASAP. So how can we correct these missteps going forward? The FTC should reopen the amplifier rule proceedings and seek comment on alternate testing conditions and specifications that better reflect real-world usage. And this is why we need you guys as a call to action to petition the FTC to reopen this rule. The FTC should establish either through rulemaking or formal staff opinion an exemption that allows active speaker amplifiers to be rated at the load impedance of the drivers they are paired with. We support the CTA's petition seeking to clarify the Commission's application of the amended trade regulation rule relating to power output claims of amplifiers utilized in home theater entertainment products designed, tested, and manufactured before the amended rule August 12, 2024. And I looked through that FTC amplifier rule, and to me, it implicated that this is retroactive, that this has to be applied to products before the August 12 deadline. And again, imagine if you bought an amplifier last year and now the manufacturer has to be held accountable to the new rule and they test it to an old standard. That's problematic. And in fact, if you look at the history of how the FTC rated amplifier power, I believe the 5-minute rule was always there, but I don't think it was very stringently enforced. But now it seems like it's being more enforced. And they don't really give you a spec. Is it a sweep? Do you run it for 5 minutes at 1 kilohertz and then you do a sweep from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz for a half a second? It's so ambiguous in this rule. There's so much open to interpretation that I think it's self-defeating to just keep it the way it is right now. We need to definitely get more specifications on this and make it a more realistic test. And then we also support the CTA's request for stay of enforcement until the Commission has addressed the issues raised by this petition. So how can you guys help? How can you help us petition the FTC? You can support the CTA's petition by commenting by November 8th. That's days away, my friends. I need you guys to be proactive here. Link to the FTC comments page for the CTA petition. I'll put that in the description below. I'll also pin it as a post. The link will be right there. And I basically want you guys to write to the FTC. I want you to mention that you would like this rule to be reopened to consider the technical issues raised by Audioholics.com and the CTA in an effort to more accurately rate amplifier power and the maximum SPL performance of powered loudspeaker systems. Tell the FTC that one measurement does not rule them all. That's my slogan. One measurement to not rule them all. So guys, we really need your help. If you are a believer of keeping amplifier power honest and getting good specifications for powered speakers and subwoofers, This is your time to act. This is your time to make a difference and help us to help move the industry in a positive direction, because it's going to be beneficial for the manufacturers. It's going to be beneficial for the retail partners. And especially it's going to be beneficial for you guys because you get more accurate information so you can make apples to apples comparisons on different product categories. So guys, I hope you like this video. Please hit the thumb up, hit subscribe. Don't forget about our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. We appreciate your support. You get direct access to me if you want to suggest video topics. And until next time, my friends, keep listening and stay amped up.